Creo que podemos empezar.
I think we can begin now. Okay, first of all, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this virtual stage. Please give me a second to switch to Spanish to explain that we have interpretation.
Please search for the globe at the bottom of your screen where you can switch to English, which is to say this event will be in Spanish. However, we have simultaneous interpretation available. So if you'd like to listen in English, again, go to the bottom of the screen. You can change over to the English channel, and I'll give those interested a second to do just that. Bueno, ahora en español de nuevo.
Okay, we're back. My name is Guy Mentel, and I'm the Executive Director of Global Americans. Global Americans is a think tank in Washington devoted to enhance relations between USA and the rest of America, primarily focusing on human rights, development, and democracy. After a year researching the effects of disinformation and propaganda in Latin America and the Caribbean, Global Americans decided to organize this event to share the key findings of the project and to see how we can create an international network of some sort to exchange ideas to fight the spread of disinformation. So I invite everyone here to use the Q&A icon if you have any questions or you wish to share an experience with us. In a moment, I will introduce our panel. But again, if somebody in the audience wants to ask something, please use the Q&A icon. And again, on behalf of Global Americas, thank you for joining us. Okay, our panel, Juan Pablo Cardenal, he's a writer, a journalist, and a researcher. And he's focused on the international promotions and really has been a foreign correspondent in China for The Economist and other Spanish papers. Since then, he has researched the consequences and implications of Chinese investments. And since then, he's also written multiple books since 2016. He's researched the soft power of China and its strategy to establish a political influence in Latin America. Juan Pablo has been a guest speaker in several international conferences and published articles in El País, El Mundo, Clarín, the New York Times, Project Syndicate, and the South China Morning Post. Thank you, Juan Pablo, for joining us. Marco Antonio Fernández is a PhD and a research professor of the Governance and Public Transformation School of Tecnológico de Monterrey, where he coordinates the Equity and Quality Education Initiative. He's also an associate researcher of México Evalúa, where he coordinates the Anti-Corruption and Education Program. He specializes in education policies and on fighting corruption and accountability. In the academic field, he has been a guest researcher at the University of California in San Diego and a visiting professor at the University of Humboldt in Germany. Arlene Tickner is a professor of the School of International, Political, and Urban Studies of the Universidad del Rosario. She earned her PhD in International Studies at the University of Miami and her master's in Latin America Studies at Georgetown University. Her research covers foreign policy of Colombia, hemispheric relations, and security dynamics in Latin America. Before joining at Rosario, she was a professor of Universidad de los Andes. In addition, she is a weekly columnist for El Espectador newspaper. Thank you, Arlene, for joining us. And also, we have Andrés Cañizález, who is a journalist and a doctor in political science. And he works at the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello. and he works also a lot with Venezuela. Thank you all for being with us today. And now let's begin with a round of questions. My first question is for Dr. Arlene Tickner. Arlene, perhaps it's better to begin with an introduction of this topic. Today, it's visible a great concern over the phenomenon of disinformation. In several settings, communication strategies have become more and more sophisticated. And with that, the spread of disinformation has affected the globe. How do you see the disinformation phenomenon in Colombia? And what's the relation between the players in Colombia and the foreign state media? And how would you also characterize their strategies and goals? Thank you, Guy, and thank you to Global Americans for organizing this event and overall for coordinating the research that we are ending on this topic. And I'm not really an expertise on, but I've been learning down the road. Undoubtedly, when we look at the resilience of democracies worldwide and how we look at the political and social differences in the globe, the misinformation has been increasingly important, for, if not enormous. And within this context, I would like to underscore that polarized societies like that of Colombia today, disinformation has more chances to be effective. So thinking about the Colombian setting generally, what we see in this country is a role that's growing in social media regarding topics in which you can see social or political divisions. For instance, in the referendum on the peace agreement with the FARC in 2016, the social process in a country that really doesn't have a long tradition of protesting. It began in 2019 until today. Processes of elections, beginning clearly with 2018 and a sensitive topic that we're seeing in other parts, like in Chile, unfortunately, of xenophobia when it comes to Venezuelans and others in Colombia. For instance, I would like to refer to an episode particularly concerning of, of a successful disinformation that took place several years ago in November 2019 on protests of the national strike that took place in the city of Bogota. About around this topic, we started to see on the social media, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp especially, reproduced on the national media as well, the idea that Venezuelans were organizing um, seizures and stealing and robbing people in their homes. And they were calling upon people to take measures on this. And this was widely broadcasted in different videos. And it reached to the point that many parts of the city of Bogota not only increased its violence, but also in many neighborhoods, the residents took weapons. I mean, they really were armed to fight against the Venezuelans. However, this was not true, but it did have a significant impact on the citizens of Bogota. I'm just thinking about the different goals of disinformation. Obviously, to deepen divisions, to represent progressive parts as allies, like Maduro, Venezuela. Here we have the Castro Chavism, which is an ally of Cuba and Venezuela, to look at the different electoral sections as well. Quickly, I would say that most of these are local and organic activities. I mean, these are all set by humans and not non-humans. And there's a lot of right-wing ideologies, but also left-wing. that we have to value here, and there's very little research on this. What's important about this project in particular is to show the urgency, not only to document and visualize measures to attack disinformation. And when we think about the interaction between local and foreign players, at least in this investigation, we didn't find a lot of evidence of coordination with foreign media. I would just stop here, but I would just like to underscore that in Colombia, the government has suggested many times that Russia and Venezuela and Cuba seek to destabilize the country through disinformation. The sources they use are limited, but I'd like to highlight that the most that we found in our analysis is that this is an important activity from Russia and Venezuela. And in the second round, I can deepen on this. Thank you. Andres, you're in Venezuela. You are in Venezuela today. So let me ask you, the situation in Venezuela is quite unique, right? In your country, we see a lot of problems with the national media, which makes the population to be very vulnerable information-wise. This means that today, Venezuelans have serious problems to access information and to compare it with others. How would you and your team and the media there, can you work within these challenges, and what measures were taken to handle this situation? And also, which are the best ways of operating to guarantee that the information that is shared is precise and verifiable? Thank you, Guy. I'd like to greet as well Arlene, Juan Pablo, and Marco, and all the colleagues that we've been working with for practically more than a year on this project. Precisely when it comes to Venezuela, it's quite atypical. And under this project, it's quite atypical. Why? Because the traditional media in Venezuela have been disappeared, purchased, really been a problem. But we have to understand the magnitude of what Venezuela has experienced in the past 5 years. This country has disappeared more than 100 newspapers, not because there were readers, but instead because the state controls the import and distribution of newspaper. So practically, we estimate that 90% of the press, written press, disappeared in recent years. And this reveals the magnitude and what we live in Venezuela. Precisely of especially the TV, Venezuela puts us in a very vulnerable, fragile spot. The people in Venezuela have a difficult time to find references. Along with to this, we can add the technical difficulties that we have. I just found here that my connection is quite poor and weak, and in Venezuela, this is common to have technical difficulties. And also, a lot of people don't have power, no access to the internet, and therefore little access to the media. So we have a lab on disinformation, and that forces us, in my analysis as a researcher, as journalists, people that move in this field, to take a lot of measures to verify information, to not only appeal to the traditional sources, but in many cases, we have to make phone calls and talk with other journalists to know if what we're handling is true. And then we have also been working on analyzing the trends of conversations on Twitter, and we have been working as well with this project. And here we see many initiatives that want to see what's happening, but also the discussions on Twitter are quite controlled by the government. Thank you, Andrés. Juan Pablo? Arlene discussed a bit the foreign state media. In this project, you have been studying disinformation in Peru, Chile, and Argentina, and your research has revealed an intense campaign of the Chinese media in this region. Could you tell us more about the setting of disinformation in Peru, Chile, and Argentina? And also, we've seen that you've written a lot about the allies of the Chinese regime in Latin America. Could you tell us more about this? Specifically, what's the strategy used in the COVID-19 context? Hello, good morning, good afternoon to you all. Thank you, Guy, and Global Americans for giving me the opportunity to share with all of you my knowledge about this topic with the audience. Well, I don't know, in 3 or 4 minutes, I can answer such deep questions, but in short, I believe that when we talk about the situation in Peru, Argentina, and Chile, it's not really that different than the rest of the region. China has strategies, global ones, that are implemented locally, depending on the circumstances of each country. But I think really China has a global strategy, and it's important to understand that besides those that follow China closely, not always do you get to understand what they do, especially with the arrival of the big state media like GTN. It seems it allows a lot of people to think that that's a way of contributing alternative viewpoints to the reality of news. And in fact, that they enrich the informative plurality, but that's a huge mistake in the media. The role that they play in the system is very different to what they do in democracies. These are really government-owned agencies that serve the power and try to spread information, disinformation, propaganda for the regime itself. Really, there are actors in a context, like Andrés said, in which so much media in the rest of the world is trying to support the crisis of the journalism sector. And we have these huge players arriving, which are transmissions of what's being done in China. And what they do, and I insist, is to handle the contents, taking advantage of the deficit of knowledge that there is in Latin America about China, its history, its political system, and its reality. So it allows these Chinese state players to spread their narratives and their propaganda with any interference whatsoever. I think that this also goes hand in hand with the topic of the allies. As you said, Guy, there's a big lack of knowledge, not only in Latin America, but I would say that most part of the world, on China because of its complexity, because the historical ties and commercial ties, and of all time, the geographic distance with China has made it impossible to have a proper knowledge of that country. And within that context, the role of those allies, quote unquote, in my opinion, are really persons, institutions that have a knowledge that's quite significant about China, either because they have participated in the efforts made by China to attract influential people to their cause, either by taking them to China or having institutional agreements that are long lasting with universities, creating the Confucius Institute, also local and regional communications agreements. We're talking about people that have been exposed to the propaganda of the Chinese regime after being invited there, then in which they have been taught the reality of China, which the Communist Party has taught them. So these are persons that have more knowledge and are authorized voices in those countries regarding China. For what I know and the efforts made, the soft power of China, the elite gathering program has been quite successful because with the establishment of these ties through institutional agreements or those trips made with all expenses paid, it creates a series of or a group of persons that are few, yes, in number, but they know a lot about China. They learn about China and what the Chinese regime represents. And so they spread all the narratives of interest for the regime. What we've seen in this research is that these allies, we're talking about more than 50 individuals and institutions in all three countries, and most of them, although there are many others, I mean, those that are active in the social media have clearly spread all the narratives that the Chinese state media wants. And they do it basically really here the idea is to present a China that has known how to struggle against COVID better than anybody, has managed it better than anybody, and has given proof of its efficiency because it has been able to eradicate poverty. And that's something we can talk about ahead. But surprisingly, with this narrative, and they also talk about the importance of China and their cooperation and how China is an opportunity for a region. And these are just narratives spread by China. And one of the big surprises of this investigation is to prove that one of the fundamental topics on the narrative of China, of the Chinese regime, is to present Chinese vaccines as those that are the safest, the most reliable. It's something fundamental for them to develop later a narrative. And these allies continuously then are spreading these viewpoints. But when it comes to vaccines, they have maintained total silence. And that's quite significant for me because I insist, and ahead we could talk about this, in all of the narrative built by China in its official media, the reliability and safety of the vaccines from China were the core, which would allow them to develop all their narrative. Thank you, Juan Pablo. Now, let's go to Marco. Marco, in your report, you mentioned that the conversation on social media, such as Twitter, and the information that's shared there is deeply tied to the life of persons, which sometimes escape the traditional analysis. And you've argued that we need a combination of public policies and computer tools to understand this better. What do you mean with this? Can you talk about the particular study that was made in Mexico, in which this strategy was used to better interpret the democracy and the geopolitical context of Mexico when it comes to disinformation. Thank you, Guy, for your question. And good morning to everyone. Thank you to Global Americans for inviting me to participate in this research project in which I personally, since I work at the Tecnológico de Monterrey, I will show you the collaboration of a group of professors of the School of Governance and also of other students who collaborated with different disciplines to disclose what you're asking about, Guy. The need to combine the technical part, yes, to be able to begin beyond the anecdote, to be able to systemize the information that's available on the social media, in this case on Twitter, and on the other hand, to see the degree of disinformation, information, or truth, or postures against or in favor of players. This year, in this year and a half, to give you an idea, we made an analysis on Twitter of this because there are legal restrictions to analyze this similarly on Facebook. So we took more than 200,000 tweets in the period from January 2020 to July 2021. What was the purpose? To see if this disinformation about the COVID was expanding greatly in Mexico, as the WHO has stated. And we found aspects that were quite shocking. Firstly, along with other investigations made, most of these have been made in English for English speaking media, and very little has been done to explore what's happening in the Spanish speaking media. And the efforts of the different colleagues from Rosario in Venezuela and CADAL, what they tried to do was to push the agenda in terms of the Spanish speaking media to see how disclosed is this disinformation. In Mexico, along with the international literature, found the disinformation is small. I mean, of the universe of the tweets analyzed, 4.5% of the tweets are under the category of disinformation or misinformation. However, what is worrying and concerning, and has to do with what Arlene and Andrés has mentioned already, is that we can clearly see on the social media the polarization of a society like that of Mexico, in which on Twitter, you can see two large groups. One side is in favor of López Obrador, and the other side is a group that criticizes López Obrador when it comes to the pandemic. Well, some external players, unlike what Pablo said, we have not found any information similar that of having a systemized influence from China or Russia to try to take advantage of this polarization in Mexico to increase disinformation. There are some tweets, yes, of propaganda, cultural about China, some tweets that did stand out, emphasizing in Russia the efficiency of the Sputnik vaccine, but foreign disinformation, no. However, what's relevant here for the life of persons is that within this context of so much polarization, it's evident to both postures, those that are criticizing emphatically what López Obrador's government has been doing regarding COVID and exaggerating some cases of disinformation about actions implemented, how the vaccination has been made. But on the other side, we see a mirror that's the other way around, a series of tweets that exaggerate the success of the government of vaccination, that lie on the rates of vaccination. So within this context, we do feel concerned. And when it comes to Mexico, in past weeks, what we've seen, the presidency of the Republic of Mexico has a systemized action, and it's been documented by different colleagues and all in the media, of lying in the conferences. Every morning, the president provides data that are not true, that produces polarization on the social media, of course, that's magnified. And when we have this effort of verifying the information to be able to illustrate why what the president is saying is a lie, what happens? Andres already mentioned this. There are systemized attacks, like we've seen in other parts of the world. I'm talking about Hungary or in India, in which their accounts organizes to attack those that criticize the governments, to say that those samples evidence lies about the vaccination are not true. So it is something worrisome, because we already have systemized politicians. We have journalists that are already underscored, or that saying that they're always liars. And we're lacking that analytical rigor. And we see a stigmatization against journalists and some media, which criticize governments. And that gives way to see that having a project like this will help us all to systemize this information. Thank you, Marco. Let me go back to Arlene. Arlene, Juan Pablo talked shortly about the soft power. You, along with your colleagues, have talked about sharp power, which is carried out by authoritarian countries, and not only want to attract and manipulate the audiences of democratic audiences through the media. So sharp power is reaching national government audiences to create political preferences within society or with other countries. Could you, I mean, tell us, how do you see this phenomenon in Colombia, and how political players or academics can fight it? Yes, this is a concept taken from literature from my team, which is much larger and more important than me, undoubtedly. We are many people really that have participated in this project. But unlike the soft power, which I feel in essence Juan Pablo has, it is really the Chinese strategy. It's more soft than sharp power. The sharp power that has circulated in literature suggests that, along with efforts made to seduce, to attract, to build positive images of a country, there's another phase of this type of strategy of the soft power, which consists to develop this information, to manipulate the opinion, and to make social and political divisions on very controversial and sensitive topics within different contexts. So I think that this is an important difference between what Russia does, in which we have more evidence, at least in the Colombian context, of Russian activity along with Telesur de Venezuela. And the Chinese activity is quite marginal in Colombia. But I would like to highlight that a non-finding of this project is to show that China's activity is not that robust as we thought when it comes to different topics. But what I want to underline here is that China projects through disinformation, very different to other states like Russia, Cuba, or Venezuela. China really seeks, and Juan Pablo has said it already, to show a positive image of the country, to create a positive investment setting, to counteract the negative versions about that country, to sell itself as a country that has grown and it's not a threat to the world, while the stamp of the country of Russia has different activities in mind. It's a spokesperson of a representative really of the lefts in the world. And the bottom line really is that Russia makes disinformation activities to create more divisions, to question democracy, to have doubts about elections. And in Colombia, it's very evident. And in other countries of Latin America, we can say the same. The US included as well in this hemisphere to have xenophobic feelings. So really the idea with Russia is not to improve its image, but instead to make the situations of division and tension even worse within determined countries. So in this case, and perhaps in the next round, we can see that although the Colombian government is not basing its accusations on scientific evidence, I would say that it's exaggerated that Russia wants to destabilize Colombia, but there is Russian activity that wants to visibilize elements that disturb the Colombian government, the police violence, social unrest, the non-implementation of the peace process, among others, which are creating a negative image of Colombia overseas. And within the country are sources of more polarization and division. So in this sense, something that I do believe that stands out that we discovered and that we have to analyze more is this recent synergy seen between the disinformation activities made by RT and Telesuro in Venezuela. RTA has grown a lot its broadcast and its readers and spectators in Latin America and worldwide. And recently, on these topics, along with the accusations of interventions made by the US in Venezuela and the intent to defeat Maduro in Venezuela, we see that when it comes to Colombia, it seems that they go hand in hand. So I think it invites us to wonder if there is some coordination between the activities of disinformation of both states when it comes to these topics. Okay, to the second part, what can we do about this? I think Marco gave us a good introduction about the urgency of tuning the strategies to detect and to underline those that disinformation. Unfortunately, in Latin America, we have a virgin. It's quite virgin. And there are very few institutions there. Colombia only has two that make fact checking of the information to report when everything is false. But we still have a lot to do ahead. Conventional media, for instance, do not have the muscle to carry out these type of activities. So the idea is to imagine collaborations among those that are making this important task with traditional media, which, because really TV and radio in Colombia is seen a lot and used a lot. So if we are in big trouble if we don't do this. And I think that the academia in Latin America has a main role to play here. Marco has said that everything is done in English outside Latin America. And this project, one of its added values is that it begins to have a discussion more robust about this phenomenon that's increasing and very worrisome within Latin America, per se. Thank you, Arlene. I see questions from the chat, but before closing this chapter about the soft power, I would like to know if Juan Pablo would like to add something. Okay, to complement what Arlene has said. I think we have to explain that these efforts of the soft power are part of a bigger strategy, which has nothing to do with the media. It's a strategy, as I explained before, to have a network of allies, like by China, to have people that are influential and to attract those persons. It's true that within this strategy that we call sharp or soft power, I assume that we have elements of both. So it's perfectly good that China would like to change its negative image worldwide. Chinese believe that the image about them given by the Western media tries to isolate them and to promote them poorly. So China wants to reach international audiences with their own information. And although this is legitimate, I do believe that we cannot forget that that strategy of the soft power shows the nature, the authoritarian nature of China. All those values are shown in that strategy. So when China has a content sharing agreement to make audiovisual contents and co-productions, the idea is not only to improve its image, but also to censor what is sensitive information for China. Not in this project, but in a previous project, I could follow how a daily, very important newspaper of news of Argentina was criticizing China a lot regarding what Cristina Kirchner was signing with China without the due transparency. And through the rebuilding of information of the Chinese embassy published by the Chinese embassy, I realized that the Chinese embassy personally, during 8 or 10 months, visited this newspaper 3 or 4 times. And after these meetings, what was issued or published by this newspaper was good for everyone, and that China was good already. And there was this shift of this viewpoint. So what happens? We have 2 executives of this newspaper traveled to China to attend a talk about the Franja de la Ruta. It's got its subject. And next, what happens? In a matter of 18 months, the ambassador of China published a dozen of opinion articles. I mean, he was given space in that same newspaper based on having a better relation, of inviting these people to China and sending them there. He has these ties, and he's given a space. It's not normal that in 18 months you can change so much your viewpoint in the newspaper. And Along with this, we started to see less criticism towards China and a lot of soft news about China, which before was never published. So I give you this example, which is a bit more sophisticated and elaborated. And at the end, we can't have this temptation, as I said before, that the fact that these players from Russia or China come to our country, they're going to contribute to have more informational plurality. They come with the values from their own countries. They have their own agenda. And yes, they try to improve their image, yes, but they want to silence or censor information, which in this case, Chinese government considered wrong. Thank you, Juan Pablo. Now we have a question. We have questions from the audience. This is from Andrés about Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. From Rosemary Santana, who's asking, so can we say that the Americas, specifically in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, among other countries, the pandemic has enhanced migrations to hurt democracy and freedom of the press? Yes, undoubtedly. The pandemic has been a perfect excuse. So the authoritarian, and especially those Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, there's much more control over the population. The regime has found in the pandemic a perfect excuse to restrict not only information, but also to recover public settings in which, in theory, they're giving information about the pandemic and COVID. And at the same time, I believe it's allowed them to control more the population socially, and along with this, the international community that has been historically following what Latin America, many countries from Europe or the US and Canada, were also focusing on serving and focused on their own sanitary crisis. So the very first year of the pandemic, you could say we had stronger authoritarianism and international community that isn't responding much to what was happening. And that's what I think could change now, because we're seeing that the countries of the North have recovered the sanitary control. Thank you, Andres. Marco, I want to give the opportunity to talk about the algorithm tool that your team developed for this project, and to explain a bit more the life cycle and the analysis that you made of the social media. Could you explain a bit more about this tool and what it tells us about today's Mexican citizenship? Thank you for your question. When it comes to the richness and the wealth of the collaboration from the schools of engineering and of governance, we created a tool in which queries, we could make good use of the Twitter to search or make queries in terms of tweets made related to notes about COVID and strategies made or reactions made in Mexico. And that way, the idea is to have a classification of the tweets. First, regarding categories of disinformation, misinformation, to see if they're true. And three other categories. One, tweets that clearly are aimed to promote the Mexican government or to attack the Mexican government, and the other group of tweets that cannot be classified. I mean, with these algorithms, like in other investigations made to enhance their power, we require a double verification to be able to see if the classification is done properly. And obviously, that's why we need to review or fact checks that we referred to before to see if the information or the tweets were false with an intent or not. Once we have that part, what I think is novel is to begin to use three complements in this analysis. One, the analysis of feelings of tweets, meaning you could see with the words used within each tweet, what is the burden or the feeling that we want from it? Because obviously, disclosing tweets has an intent, either to polarize, to increase negativity, or to promote a posture of a political player, to have a part that's more emphatic on positivity, of good feelings in favor of that player. So when we analyzed that part, we realized that there were contrasts. On one hand, the tweets considered true have a neutral language. They're not emphasizing something positive or negative. However, what for us was even more interesting is that when it comes to the tweets that are aimed to criticize the government, the negativity words stand out as part of the content. While in the cases of the tweets in favor of the government, the tweets emphasize or use terms that are positive. But the tweets that are false, it's important to underline for those that are listening, especially the journalists, our colleagues, how in Mexico, you can see that language tends also to be neutral. Why? Because what they want, what these tweets want, is to try to persuade that they're true tweets when clearly the content of their information is false. Okay, when you see this, what complements with the analysis is how long in the cyberspace these tweets are spread to understand if the logic of these messages is efficient or not. For instance, we saw that overall, the tweets have a life cycle relatively short. However, when they are from accounts with a lot of followers, that the life cycles obviously increase, especially the life cycles of tweets precisely that are false, of disinformation. The other part of the tool that allows us to have an analytical lens to closely look at the logic of the spread of these messages is to make an analysis of the network to see how the players are connected around the spread, the information spread. Because if we're going to talk about all these strategies that my colleagues are talking about, we need this technical part to see the intent of these tweets. In this case, the analysis of media, what allowed was to identify these groups. One, those around the core, which is the president, López Obrador, and it's evident there are two antagonistic groups, those in favor, those against. But also, just like other colleagues from Universidad of Guadalajara and Viteso, they have found, and we found something similar, in Mexico, a governor from the state of Mexico also uses strategically the media. And it's evident when we see the analysis with our tool you can see the group of accounts that's in favor, also against, and they attack López Obrador. So I think that this effort to systemize how to disclose the tweets, how, or what are the feelings, how long they last, that's the path to be able to deepen and advance and understand more these strategies. We were told in some of the questions that I was reading, Central America, we need to apply a similar analysis to the one we used in Mexico to answer with facts beyond what we think. If it's true that in Nicaragua and other countries of Latin America, no, of Central America, these strategies take place. What's reported suggests that it does, but we don't have systemized evidence, that shows how strategically the media has been used to disclose messages, to clearly have certain feelings, and if they're efficient and if they last long by groups that are in favor of the governments, either from El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and those that criticize them using the media. Thank you, Marcos. I'd like to ask a question for Arlene about Colombia and Venezuela, which are not only joined Colombia, Venezuela geographically, but also socially, politically, and economically. And during our project, there was a small attachment between the findings of Colombia and Venezuela, especially regarding the Russian Venezuelan disinformation in Colombia. So, Arlene and Andrés, what was the role of this disinformation in the most recent protests in Colombia? And did this activity have an impact on public opinion? I think it's very hard to talk about a specific effect, but undoubtedly this visibility of Russia alone and sometimes with Venezuelan media, especially after analyzing Telesur, tries to magnify the role of the state violence, especially police violence in the protests. And it focuses on underscoring a situation of enormous political and social instability in Colombia. And sometimes this contrasts with information about Venezuela that especially has to do with the intermission of the states and its intention to destabilize Venezuela. So I think it's hard to state what's the effect of this on protests. But there's no doubt what we've seen so far are intense, if not coordinated. The idea is to visibilize these specific aspects of the social protests of Colombia. This is not fake news, let me state that, because indeed, however, there has been police brutality in these protests. But again, the goal here, the bottom line, is to accentuate division and to make political and social divisions. So if the Colombian government has reacted twice and has identified the unduly adherence of Russia, means that the Colombian government is feeling, at least, that these intentions are creating some effects among the public audience. In Venezuela, part of what has allowed us to make this investigation is to identify in Colombia and allows us to see how the Venezuelan state media or the official accounts of Venezuela are aligned perfectly to position themselves in the regional geopoliticals in Colombia. It wasn't part of the period of analysis, but also it was lived in Cuba with the protests and how the agenda of the Venezuelan media was aligned. And secondly, it went vis-a-vis with the Russian strategy to trigger polarization in other countries as a strategy to create conflicts, I believe. But my opinion is to create chaos uh, within the democracies of the region, to somehow, we have a saying in Venezuela, to fish in the wrong river. Andres, I'd like to ask two questions too at the same time. One is from the audience, and the question it's from Marcelo Rodriguez. He's asking, are there examples of countries in the region in which measures have been taken by the government or social society to fight disinformation successfully? And second question, what's a challenge for your countries and other countries in Latin America to handle the effects of propagation of disinformation, organic and inorganic? And what can we do to mitigate these measures among civil societies and in the academia? Guy, I'd like to answer both questions because in the report for the Mexican case, we reviewed extensively the policies made in other parts of the world to try to fight or to stop disinformation. And this is a very complicated aspect because, on the one hand, there are those that bet on self regulating the media. We've seen this in Facebook that doesn't seem to be very efficient beyond making promises, and different efforts made by the University of New York, from the Guardian, ProPublica, to review if truly the control policies of disinformation in the political messages on Facebook were blocked by Facebook itself. So when it comes to self-regulation, it doesn't seem a good tool. But on the other hand, regulation, government regulation will solve this, is another extreme. And it's bad because we'll have censorship saying that I'm trying to control disinformation. Authoritarian governments and even democratic governments can think that regulation is good to censor messages. We've seen it recently. If I don't remember wrong, the Wall Street Journal some days ago said that Bolsonaro is attacking the proposals made by judges to rule disinformation on social media, especially because this country is having the presidential campaign now. And President Bolsonaro, which benefited from the political disinformation on the social media, he obviously doesn't want to see any control that minimizes the content of fake information for the presidential campaign. Others that talk about the importance of what Arlene mentioned, that there are institutions in Colombia and in Mexico. There are efforts to make what's called verification, the fact checkers, in which the problem here, okay, that's expensive. It takes time. You need specialized knowledge. You need resources to implement this. Besides, when it's more expensive, the effort of disinformation, the width of the band of these fact checkers isn't as big because the wave of disinformation is much larger than what we can check. So, the last point, there are colleagues that say that that education is important and that we have to emphasize to the traditional media about this. But recent studies, for instance, the University of Turk said that that strategy or solution is not that good. One, because polarization contacts people tend to filter the information and see only thing that's consistent with their ideology. So let's give more sources of information that's verified, will help to have that will help to be better than with disinformation, shows that it's not very efficient. So that's why this topic is very, very complicated, especially those that are here with me know this. When the system or the business model to finance the traditional media is in crisis because they cannot charge for the contents. Therefore, advertisers don't want to do it to advertise in traditional media, and that is making more pressure, building pressure, so that the fact checkers can work poor. So having a fact checker group like that of the Washington Post or the New York Times in papers of Latin America that have a business model problem, frankly, for me, is not feasible. That's why the importance of enhancing more collaborative efforts between civil society, the media, and the academia to have more robust fact checkers against disinformation. Thank you, Marco. The last question for Juan Pablo comes from Patricio Florentino, who asks, besides the disinformation of countries like China and Russia, how is disinformation being used in countries in the region to create divisions within each country, especially the far right? How are they using this? And the minority groups. I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. The question has to do how the political and economic elites use this information from Russia and China. How do they do it? It's a difficult question to answer. What I can say, for what I know, a part of these elites that is tied to China spread the propaganda that comes from the Chinese regime. And they do it because they believe in that, or it's a good opportunity, or because they're convinced to do so. I don't know what motivates them, but many elites, including a good number of political representatives in the region that are spreading the information, the Chinese propaganda. That is a fact. I raised my hand regarding what Marco said, and I'd like to add that obviously to find solutions for disinformation is almost an impossible mission because it's very complicated. It's complicated enough to try to have a good diagnostic, but something that I wanted to share with the audience that I found in this research are two examples of what we can call disinformation. And it's how China, and as I said before, how China has been able to build a narrative based on an event. I don't know if it's false, but of doubtful veracity. Let me explain this. Let's talk about COVID. The purpose of the study, or the period of our study is when the vaccines were developed. And right before that, China internationally was responsible for the spread of the pandemic. And China uses that to launch a propaganda campaign, January, February 2020, to try to elude its responsibility to deny the origin of the virus. And within that context, it launches a campaign of what they call donations. Many of the donations were really sold, nothing was free. So they start to boost a narrative based on the reliability and safety of vaccines, of their vaccines, to show China as a scientific and technological power, yes, but to tell the world that they already had an answer. But what took place during those months until today that I know of, China has not presented any evidence so that its vaccines could be considered as really reliable and safe. And that shows the results of what they're doing in phase 3. What the other technological companies of the world, nobody even questioned the reliability and safety of those other vaccines. But in China, at no given time, they have shown any results to the international community. And repeatedly, they have launched selective information, the legitimation of leaders in Latin America and worldwide of the Chinese vaccine, but really China never presented scientific evidence over its vaccines. And still, they have built a narrative with that they have made a vaccine that's perfectly reliable and safe. Months passed by, and we saw how in 2 countries, which were mainly vaccinated with the Chinese vaccine, in Peru, Uruguay, and Chile, 3 countries, the cases, the deaths, etc., hospitalizations, kept increasing for a long time, while in the countries like the US or Israel, which vaccinated with Western vaccines, the rates started to drop. So I want to give this example to say that sometimes disinformation doesn't have to be something very sophisticated, but instead, the Chinese repeat constantly or try to remove all suspects over them about the inefficiency of the Chinese vaccines repeatedly in their narrative, but not with scientific evidence. And still, within the context that China has vaccinated or sent vaccines to 70 or 80 countries worldwide, nobody really has questioned or has gone against that narrative. So at the end, I don't know if we can call that disinformation, but there's a factor there if those vaccines are reliable and safe. Because China has not presented any scientific evidence, but still, it has created this enormous narrative based on the fact that they are. And for me, that's a clear example of disinformation. And to complement this, I'd like to say China has pushed within this context of COVID, when they have a narrative about the superiority of their vaccines based supposedly of their good management. of the pandemic and based on the fact that they were able to develop their vaccines. At the same time, the Chinese present evidence for their superiority, the idea that they entirely eradicated poverty in China. However, if you analyze what are they based on to say that idea, what they're saying really is that nobody in China, I mean, they have eradicated poverty, but for them, poverty is $2.25 a day. And they say that it's above that of the World Bank. And it's true, but what they leave out based on that, and they build another narrative, is that that value is optimum is for countries like Ethiopia with low income. China is considered by the World Bank instead as an economy of medium and high earnings income. So the threshold of poverty of China should be $5.50. So if China would have used that rate, it can never say that it has eradicated poverty. Instead, it should say that 13% of its population, 200 million, still live below the threshold. In fact, the vice president of China a year or so said that 600 million people live with 1,000 yuans a year. Those are $5.13 a day. So if we listen to those words, 600 million Chinese are poor. So, however, with the idea that China has struggled against poverty, and it sets itself as it was a highly developed country, and it sits down with the US and European countries that have not questioned that data. But generally, what I've seen in Argentina, Chile, and Peru, with exceptions, obviously, is that that narrative has been spread without any resistance. Nobody questioned this. Many of their allies, through their tweets and their tribunes, have honored the Chinese regime for eradicating poverty and handling wonderfully the COVID. But I question the veracity of both narratives from China. I do it personally, and that's something I haven't seen that has done in the press in Latin America. I mean, or any other country really. And I think it's basically because of the lack of knowledge that I talked about early. There's this lack of knowledge about China. Getting into, nobody really wants to go against China. You're risking too much. So if we have this context in which China has been modernizing for the past 40 years, and it goes from being one of the poorest economies of the world, and now it's the second richest. But the reality, the mantra, their slogan is incorrect. It's got a structural weakness, and still very few media and the general public has questioned this at all. Thank you, Juan Pablo. Okay, that unfortunately it's time to finish. Thank you all for your time, for joining us. Thank you to our panelists and everybody that participated in this event. I saw that Mauro asked where we could access to the different investigations. I'd like to remind you that we will publish this report and other articles in the coming weeks. So you can keep in touch with us through our website, which is www.theglobalamerican.org or our social media channels such Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, or Instagram. On behalf of the Global Americans team, thanks again, and we'll be in touch.